Hi, everyone. Well, it's great to see so many people here, considering that we are in the beginning of the semester and everyone is still outside, because it's still summer. I think next time, I have a suggestion. Next time we should do these events outside, using the lawn. What about that? Could be cool, no? I vote for that. So we have Scott Pask tonight. I have to say that I'm actually co-hosting this event with Diane Paulus. So imagine that she's here with me, like with the glasses, like me. She's the artistic director of the American Repertoire Theater at Harvard University. But unfortunately, she cannot be here today yet. And she sent a very nice note to Scott, and I will be reading it afterwards. It's a kind of short 2-minute letter. So I'm Silvia Benedito. I'm an assistant professor in the landscape department and coordinator with Krzysztof Wojcicko at the MDes program in art design and public domain. I'm also part of this wider faculty, multi-departmental faculty group, the Sensory Media Workshop platform, where we look at various ways to integrate art practices with design thinking and design and making of design. In our workshops and open seminars, we are very committed to actively engage the body, engage the senses, as means to heighten a sensibility, to create a sensibility to spatial qualities of the built environment, the ones we live, the ones we design, the ones we imagine and project. Also, and paired with these ambitions, the Rouse Visiting Artist program through our dean engages several artists this year, 6 or 7, kind of. It's huge, very strong program this year. So we can learn from them, engaged with their, his, her methods and techniques. And this engagement with the arts, it's not a new project. In the education of architects and designers, think about our ever-present reference, older references, architects, Palladio, Alberti, Michelangelo, Inigo Jones, very appropriate here for our session today, Christopher Wren, William Kent, Capability Brown, all designers educated on this kind of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary mode. And in the modernity, our references, Corbusier, Gropius, and Lawrence Alprin, and I will stop on these names because suddenly we're talking about the GSD as an institution at the foundational time in its modern foundation on its modern curriculum when the Bauhaus pedagogy got implemented here while continuing the exploration on multidisciplinary integrative modes of teaching and producing. So what makes this, well, I'm talking about the GSD and also the legacy, and what makes this new ambition, meaning the re-nurturing of this sensibility, multidisciplinary sensibility, into our design education, what makes this new ambition important to us is the fact that the definition of design, its role and constituencies, we believe that are wider, also harder to establish because we live in very complex days and demanding days. We are called to respond several times to challenges of global magnitudes and challenges, social, economic, ecological. We operate in disparate cultural realms and often conflicting social conditions. So more and more, this context also demands interdisciplinary approaches, a broader consideration of media, timescales. It also demands expanded skills to communicate our design ambitions to a broader audience. You know, when we talk about social participation, engagement, building consensus, etc. So it's not easy to communicate design. So our project here, what we are doing here today, it's about making sense, but it's also re-nurturing this sensibility. So in sense and sensibility, and suddenly we are in Jane Austen kind of realm, which seems very appropriate. So it's with this kind of ambition and legacy of the school and desire that we feel very lucky in having Scott here today. As you have read in Chantel's note, Scott Pask is award-winning scenic designer who was raised in Yuma, Arizona. He received his Bachelor of Architecture degree and Honorary Doctorate from the University of Arizona, and he holds also a Master in Fine Arts from Yale School of Drama. And from here, because I'm co-introducing, and Diane is here, don't you see her? So I'm gonna read her letter. And it's a very personal and friendly letter to Scott because he's also her colleague. I'm honored to be co-introducing Scott Pask today, and only sorry not to be there in person as I'm in the rehearsal room in New York City this afternoon. Scott and I have been long-time collaborators and friends. We first met as graduate students when I was assisting the director, André Serban, on Massenet's opera, Thais, and Scott was assisting the production set designer. I remember sitting by the set model together, assisting this world-class director and designer, and dreaming of what our futures would be. We began doing shows together, literally, on the streets of New York City. And our first collaboration was a site-specific production of Tennessee Williams, 10 blocks on the Camino Real on Stanton Street between Ludlow and Orchard Street. Scott used the rooftops of the buildings and the windows of the shops on the street as a set design. He also designed a giant dragon puppet that was made out of plastic garbage cans that residents from the community painted. Our work on the Lower East Side continued with the original creation of the Donkey Show in the former Speakeasy on Ludlow Street. The Donkey Show, now in its 7th year at Art Oberon in Harvard Square, is a disco adaptation of A Midsummer Night's Dream, in which the enchanted Athenian woods of Shakespeare play became the iconic 70s nightclub Studio 54, complete with a dance floor for the audience. Sounds like fun. From there, flash forward to the first big musical I directed, Hair, which Scott designed for the Delacour Theater in Central Park. Scott embraced the natural environment of the park and the sky over our heads as a backdrop for the production. When the show later transferred to Broadway, we made the deliberate decision not to put Central Park on a stage, but rather to embrace the actual Broadway theater we were in as a new setting. So on Broadway, the Hippie Be-In was now happening at the All Hirschfeld Theater. It was a decision about being honest about the environment we were in. Scott also designed the first opera I directed, Monteverdi's Orfeo, where we used the distressed back wall of the Bum Harvey Theater to represent the bowels of the underworld. We have even done the circus together, collaborating on the creation of Amaluna for Cirque du Soleil, where a magical island atmosphere was designed to encompass the entire audience. We have been on a mutual journey, stretching ourselves from American musicals to Cirque, to bringing the world of the circus to Broadway with our production of Pippin. And those are only the shows he's done with me. Scott has designed more than 45 productions on Broadway. 45 productions on Broadway. This past season alone, he had 7 running simultaneously. And he won 3 Tony Awards for his design. He worked extensively off-Broadway, in London's West End, and in the opera world, including the Metropolitan Opera House. As you can see, Scott's body of work is vast. He's gone from grassroots to grandiose. But through it all, what I have cherished about my collaboration with Scott is that he's always dedicated to creating a world on stage. What he creates is never just decoration or set dressing. He always asks, what are the rules of the world? How do you create a world where all the events of the story can happen? Scott is also able to create designs that are flexible and adaptable. He makes sets that can change as a show changes, and that is a crucial skill. How to make big, bold decisions about set design that still allow you to make discoveries in a rehearsal room or in previews in front of an audience. Scott and I also share an appreciation for less is more, and of finding what is necessary on stage, leaving room for the audience to exercise their imagination. Scott cares about the characters, the cast, the words, and the music as much as he does about his own set design. And that is what you crave in the theater: collaborators who bring their own expertise, but are alone, above, all dedicated to the bigger story you are telling. So, and why is Scott here today? He's trained as an architect. So, thank you so much, and please join me in welcoming Scott.
Thank you for coming today. It's very kind of Diane. That means a lot. We both kind of grew up together doing this, and we were students together when we first met, and it's been 17 years since we started our collaboration, and it extends till today. We actually were in the studio last week with Sarah Bareilles working on a new musical called Waitress that will be on Broadway in the spring. I'm going to try to go really quickly because I think it's important that you get a sense of context of the work that I do. I think picking apart a couple of projects would be not really doing it would do a disservice to kind of the chameleon-like nature of what I've got to do as a set designer. I have to change my personality and my stylistic work to best serve the work that I am serving. So this evening I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I came to do what I do and what exactly that is that I do as a set designer, and discuss that process a little bit. And then while presenting some of my work, I'll hopefully show you how I attach meaning to form, and while serving a narrative structure, which I use to design. I basically use design to convey meaning as much as I can. This actually is a play that I did this season, and it's not exactly the kind of work that I imagined doing when I was in school in architecture. My personal taste is much more austere and may reflect the upbringing that I have in the desert of Arizona, but which is in itself an abstract place. But this is, as I said, I have to be a chameleon. So what I do is I tend to embrace the work and the text in which I'm working. And this specific project, when the curtain went up, the details down to the silver-plated exercise bicycle, kind of introduced the character who owned that house all to herself. And so when the curtain went up to gasps, and then they were quickly followed by laughter, and there's a sort of faux, what I call the faux huli, the chihuly fixture at center, this sort of rouged fabric ceiling and exaggerated moldings, and the whole thing is sort of in a false perspective. It set the tone for Megan Mullally to kind of make her entrance, and already we knew something about her. I grew up in Yuma, Arizona, not exactly an urban or cosmopolitan environment. I didn't really know much about theater. I knew the Annie soundtrack back and forth, but I was always interested in art and drawing and houses. I always loved looking at houses, and I enjoyed awards shows. So when I saw the Tonys the first few times as a kid, I was fascinated by the scale models of the designers, because back then the Tonys actually showed quite extensively the artistic collaborations between costume, lighting, and scenery. And I'm grateful for that, because I don't think I would have found what I'm doing today without those awards shows, as sort of trite as that sounds. But back when they were being shown, I just looked at those people and the work that they were doing, and I just sat there kind of going, I can't imagine these people actually, they have such an elaborate hobby. Like, how could that possibly be a job? I mean, my dad drove a beer truck and ultimately worked in a bottling company, and I learned how to ride a bicycle between speed bumps in a trailer park, so that was sort of out of the realm of possibility. So I continued with my love of houses and pursued architecture at the University of Arizona alongside Rick, and I found that I was drawn to studying and making spaces that considered how a person felt in them, most importantly, and about emotional content. And not just as a sort of programmatic sidebar, like that became the driving force for the genesis of the work that I was doing. And I studied in Italy, and again, opposing my personal taste, what I found most intriguing was the work of the Italian Baroque architects. Borromini was fascinating to me, his plasticity of form and his masterful use of false perspective, something that I am still today fascinated with, and he was hugely influential. And this is another example of his, which I still am blown away by, and I saw it even just a couple of months ago again. I have to throw in Palladio, because Teatro Olimpico was massively influential. This one, Bernini, his work in architecture and sculpture, another huge influence. And this colonnade especially, it's sort of wonder-inducing / anxiety-inducing curve leading you into the unseen terminus, where you emerge at the point where this cathedral facade was at its most impactful. These were just all impressive and thoughtful examples to me of exploring form and emotional response, which became something that I was obsessed with. And I first saw the first opera I saw was in Modena, where Pavarotti hailed from, and it was Turandot. I'm going to jump back a little bit. So I took these influences back to Arizona and began to study theater while I was taking an elective course in the fine arts department. And this course had a ton of prerequisites, and the architecture school and the school of theater there were really helpful to me in understanding that I was incredibly serious about studying theater. They saw the models that I brought over from the architecture school and understood that I would be a serious addition to the class, and I wasn't there just to glide by on an easy elective. So I got my degree in architecture, and I knew that my goal was to do theater. So I studied that at a graduate level after working in New York for a few years. Okay, enough explanation. I'm going to show you some work. It's going to be a broad survey. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of context with each of them, but there's so much information for each of these and stories that could go on for days. Stop me if there's anything we want to talk more about, or we'll catch that at the end with Sylvia. But I just want to show you a sort of arrangement of pieces. This is, the one thing I also want to say is emotional content, and while you're looking, my work is ephemeral, and it's also like intangible, and it's also largely about creating moments. As much as it's about creating spaces, it's also trying to figure out what are those moments that are going to stay with somebody beyond that theater. When they walk out the door, going like, oh my God, I got chills when Cheetah did that, or I can't believe Jane Krakowski descended from the ceiling in a towel, and something that gave somebody chills. And each of these moments that I try to create, some of them are fleeting. Well, they're all fleeting. No performance is the same again. They're unrepeatable, and they change each time. It can be a different audience. Someone responds to a moment differently. A dropped light cue, a prop that was mistakenly put somewhere else, so someone has to riff for a minute. A brilliant laugh, or a phone goes off in the audience that completely throws the actor on stage and turns it into another thing spinning off to stage left. So that whole process is something that's not even about what the physical environment is, but it's something that I love. This is a slide for a project I did about 8 or 9 years ago with David Mamet play called November with Nathan Lane. And this was, for me, it's a slightly vulgar president getting ready for his getting ready for re-election and trying to win that election, and meanwhile everything's kind of going wrong. And what I did was I took this kind of almost like a Fabergé egg, and plopped it on stage, and then it's in this context of a blue box, but everything you can see is paled out to a degree, is that these Memetian characters that come out with such strong language and are so present and bold that they almost end up like Sharpie strikes against this paled out landscape. This is it in reality. It was a huge challenge for the prop team. I work with a ton of prop people and fabricators, furniture makers. The drapery was even sewn in false perspective. You kind of see the molding just starts getting larger and larger as it comes off to left and right. But also, even what I'm also doing in rehearsal with Nathan, who I've worked on with a bunch of plays and musicals, he was in rehearsal with this, and when we put the sofa on stage, it didn't work in perspective because it hadn't been adjusted. And so they'd been used to this sofa for quite a long time. And so what I had the props people do backstage without telling anybody, and I've never told anybody this publicly, is that every day for a week and a half, we would shave off about a 32nd of an inch of the 2 sofa legs on the upstage side to get it to drop into perspective. And I had timed it out so that once we got to the first preview, it would get there, and it worked. He never noticed his feet getting slightly closer to the floor, and nobody was told. The props team was sworn to secrecy. But that's the kind of stuff that you adapt to these challenges, and Nathan's a trooper, so even if he did notice. And also in the stack of books there, right off to the left, are all these legal books, and shoved in the middle was a first edition of Cujo, and only like 5 people could see it, but it's something that we all loved. And the people that did see it gave a sense of, it was specific to his character. It wasn't just from my own sense of humor. It just shows just the level of detail. We had carpets made, printed, and Dylan Baker is a genius. This was just a quick project. I was working on something with Sam Mendes, a Shakespeare project, and we ended up postponing it. And the Times, New York Times, asked me to do a fashion editorial with them. So I just kind of was riffing on what I was doing and playing with scale. I ended up doing this with an actor called Sam Riley, who was doing a movie about Joy Division at the time called Control. And it was just great playing with an object that was highly detailed, and he's a great guy. And playing again, I always like playing with states of decay when they're appropriate. This was a time for I want to talk about director and who I work with and how I work with them. I'm most often hired by a director and sometimes a producer of a project, and then they assemble a multidisciplinary team, including costume, lighting, and sound. A lot of us work together a lot. Sometimes it's the first time. But hopefully together we're supporting a shared vision or approach to the work. And that vision can be the point of view that the directors come up with over time, but most often it's approach that we evolve together over discussion and throughout the entire design process. And it's a big misconception that I'm handed a design idea by a director and go off to my Dickensian studio and just churn it out into a model, presenting it to his exacting details or hers. My role is literally to be the design director, and I was trained at Yale as a director in a way of space, and we had to conceive our projects as well as design them, so we come from a dramaturgical point of view. So this process can be incredibly elliptical and be a lot of backing and forthing, or it can be incredibly highly focused. This process of discovery about the ideas that we want to convey or suggest through the three-dimensional aspects of the design, and then the mediums, which to me, very importantly, lighting and sound. Lighting defines how my work is perceived, so it's very important to me. And this layer of concept is really ever present throughout the process and informs every decision I make, down to the cutlery, because I'm responsible for every visual element that's not a costume. In this case, this is an extreme reimagining of a famous Chekhov play called The Three Sisters that takes place in 1901 in a Russian provincial town. The settings in that play are 4. They take place in a drawing room, an exterior countryside, a bedroom, lots of samovars. Doing this out of town, the director John Doyle, who've done a number of projects with, he just said, let's experiment with this. And I said, if I'm going out of town to do this, I want to do this and not have a birch tree in sight, because famously these Chekhov plays are always done with birch trees. And so we placed it in the context of a ruined Russian palace that had these layers of history that we had impressed upon it, telling it almost in modern day, and the fall of the Russian monarchy, then taking that room that was inhabited by a communistic office, and then the lifting of borders and openness to Western society. This is all to kind of support our very sort of precise view of this family and their quest to get to Moscow, which was supported in the text, and this is the model. So we make I start with sketches and thumbnails, and then we'll very quickly go to model, and this shows the finished model of the project before we get to the space, and you can see how it translates very closely. This was the exterior scene when all the fluorescents came on. This was an early sketch for a project called Les Liaisons Dangereuses that I did on Broadway with Ben Daniels and Laura Linney. And our take, this was with Rufus Norris, who's now the head of the National Theatre in London. And what we decided was this was ultimately a play. I'm breaking it down to the very rude and crude about vanity and the characters. Just really the trifling that they were doing amidst such unrest and the sort of masses of people that were not even able to eat. And meanwhile, they're kind of having card table shenanigans. So what I did is I took this room, this 18th century room, and painted it like a high gloss black. The floors were reflective glass, and then there's a slice through the whole room of two-way mirror. So throughout the show, there was this presence of the servant class behind that glass wall that you could just see kind of shuffling along, or sometimes they would stay there to witness a specific moment, and sometimes there would be secret doors in that glass wall that they would be punctured by those people, but they punched home the idea of what you're doing is being watched, and this will come to haunt you. And that slice of glass was my kind of guillotine that was going to be coming through their necks in 3 years. This kind of blob of fabric started to be this kind of luxurious thing, and then as we moved through the play, and this is the model for that, and the clothes were so incredibly elaborate, but as we proceeded, that thing became the cobweb, and again, which they were kind of caught. And you can see in the model how I'd sort of conceived of the servant class watching what they were doing, and this was the last moment in the show where that beauty had kind of turned into just a tragic web. This was a sketch for Peter Grimes that I did at the Metropolitan Opera with the same director as that Chekhovian play. It takes place in a British East Coast fishing town. A man, Peter Grimes, is a societal outcast, and he's been cleared at the beginning of this of an accidental death of an apprentice. And the design was highly influenced by these black tarred net huts that are on the southern coast of England, and they sit kind of on the beach, almost like witches, just staring out, and it's where the fishermen dry their nets. And this abstracted space, the abstracted space that I had conceived, served the physical spaces in the opera, because it does take place in like a pub, a small hut, the town square, and church square as well. And I said, at the same time, this abstracted space compresses, expands, and releases. These massive walls are kind of moving all night long, and they demonstrate in concept while they're also demonstrating the physical spaces that we need, but they're demonstrating this opera really about societal pressure and mob justice. And they force his suicide, actually, after the accidental death of his second apprentice, which they perceived as manslaughter, and all is ultimately clear when he is removed from the horizon. So this is the series of sketches that I did to show the director at first, and then to the Metropolitan. And based on these sketches, they said, please proceed. And it was massive. It's the first time they've taken out the gold curtain at the Met Opera in many, many years. And it was filled with a huge proscenium of this tarred, blackened wood. And those towers moved left and right to shape the spaces. And these are just some of the various looks of the opera. A pub scene. And it's one of the most beautiful choral operas, and I just loved this project so much because it was just from beginning to end just so conceptually clear. Like the opera itself has one of the largest choruses I've ever heard, and that translated so clearly to the politics of the show was thrilling to me. And it's all about judgment. The last moment when he's at home deliberating what his last move is going to be, when he's been told to go out to sea and sink his ship. And then it parts, and that's the end of the show. So those towers have been hidden while he was in that moment. I'm going to talk about schedule a little bit now. Steady Rain, this was a project. Some of these projects take years. Operas can take 2 or 3 years to happen, musicals as well. Some happen in a matter of weeks. This was a project that I was asked to do with Daniel Craig, and I was beginning it with Barbara Broccoli, who does the James Bond films, and we were working out of her offices in Hyde Park, and we were going to be doing it in London, and we were looking for our second actor. And Hugh expressed great interest, and his children were getting ready to start school, so we ultimately moved over to New York to do this on Broadway, and theaters were remarkably made available, no wonder. And this happened very, very quickly, and it was scripted to take place in sort of like an interrogation room of sorts, very, very, very literal. And I just sat down, and this is how I work in the very beginning. I do these thumbnails, and this was a series of the significant events in the play. And at the very end, you'll find out, I'll tell you what it's about. There's like a ghost story. Something happens, this crime, and you find out that actually one of them is not alive. And they're having this conversation back and forth and grilling each other. And ultimately, these events have already happened. It's someone who's kind of having this internal struggle with himself and dealing with the ghost of his friend. But it's being told as interrogation. So this is sort of taking a little bit of stage magic and a few liberties as well. It's like when you've got Daniel Craig and Hugh Jackman, I sort of felt like, I don't want to open up the curtain. Oh, there's a room and there's a door. Come on in, sit at the table. Like, let's open up the curtain and freak people out. So the curtain opened up and the two of them were like sitting 3 feet away from the edge of the stage and people gasped. So I was like, okay, that's good. And then let's get on with the story. So there are significant locations in this story, and it does go through a police drama, but each of them, there were like 4, and I felt like, I can tell these within this black void and start to have them almost appear as visions. So in the model, that was the first look. And I did the costumes on this as well, and so yeah, Daniel had to wear a cheap suit and grow a mustache, but he was great about it. They're both amazing guys. So the first one, and this is all happening behind black scrims. Even like in theater, we're kind of lighting from the side, so at least in this case, so we don't catch the scenery. We're trying to make some visual trickery happen here without letting the light spill. So there are like portals hiding all the lights, and each of those portals had a sort of almost Turrell-esque like knife edge, so you don't scrape like across any surfaces. You're trying to get rid of any perception of anything that would like make you lose the notion of that void. And these pieces we had everything carpeted backstage, so these massive pieces of scenery that were done in false perspective were flying in ever so slowly and then drifting, and then they would just appear behind the scrim when the moment in the text called for them. That was like a really tiny thumbnail. And so these actually were kind of moving in front of you, but we had to get up on huge cherry pickers just to even watch them being built in the shop because they were so extreme. Again, the model, and that whole piece is probably only about 18 inches thick or deep. And then the last confrontation takes place outside in this forest. So this is a combination of trying to keep the space abstract by having those interrogation lamps overhead, and then 3-dimensional scenery and painted scenery just to kind of layer in. Nine was a musical that I did with Antonio Banderas and Jane Krakowski, and it takes place in an Italian spa with a Fellini-esque director who's lost his inspiration for a film, and the women in his life arrive to hopefully inspire him to finish his movie. And I chose to take an architecture of an Italian ruin and make a surgical and modern insertion into the space. I was inspired by Scarpa, actually. I'd been to Verona, I'd seen one of his museums, and I loved how they kind of dovetailed together so beautifully. And here, representing the loss of inspiration, the women who inspire and reignite his work, and evoking the play's setting in an actual spa, kind of layering that together with just the idea of personal history in the past and the future, which is hopefully represented in the design, and the duality of the architecture of ruin and the architecture of modernity. And also throughout the play, trying to be able to create the dream spaces that are called upon. This series of images really also shows how important lighting can be, and when it's used most beautifully, and how a space can be revealed over time. This revealed the characters very slowly, and those glass panels would spin, they would leave, and you'll see there's a curtain behind them that sits in a canal of water upstage, and that was made out of Tyvek. I'd been playing with a FedEx envelope, and I sat there and holding it up to the desk light, and the light that would come through it was so amazing. So I had the shop built into this massive curtain out of Tyvek, and it sat in this canal, and it ultimately kind of was pulled across to reveal those 3 graces and this kind of mosaic. And then also timed in the music, that ellipse which they're all standing in is now filled with water. It was timed. Those women, that wall wept water into the canal, and then it flooded and filled up that disc. And then at this precise moment when Jane is singing, it crashed over into this trough, which you can just kind of catch a glimpse of there. And it was pretty cool. it's just a lot about rehearsal and a lot about how you're timing moments, but also not just thinking about the physical space, you're thinking about the moments that are going to be impactful and how is that going to like give someone chills. I mean, that's sort of why I'm in theater. I want chills. The last moment when you can, this is when he's sort of at his most kind of barren. He's figured out the inspiration, and these lighting rigs have all kind of come down, but as the women are leaving him and kind of leaving him to his own devices, they start walking up the spiral stair, and the very last strains of the music, they are all of them on that, completely filled from top to bottom, and the way that they've all entered the show was by coming down, and as if from the heavens, and as they left, the last strain of the music, there were 3 electromagnets above, below, and at that balcony level. They all disengaged, and as this last strain of music was pulling, we did this kind of last punch, and it just slowly spun around, and it was kind of another one of those awe-inducing moments, and people just gasped at all of that as the curtain was kind of coming down. This was a quick sketch for a comedy that I did called The Ritz, that I did at Studio 54. The model, and it's a sort of caper comedy in a gay bathhouse, literally and figuratively about doors, comic timing, how fast can a person get from here to there, and then playing with the director saying, oh, let's just do this big phallic centerpiece in the middle and be really blunt about it. But it's like, you can see like a completely different challenge. Like each of those rooms, things were taking place. There were moments where there were shows internal to the bathhouse. Rosie Perez was in this and did a number. We had this kind of crazy curtain that came down. And it's just really about evolving and adapting to each of these challenges. And then later the next season, this was Pal Joey in the same theater space, a musical with that same director. And this was where we started to embrace a bunch of automation. There were 2 turntables on the left and right there. And then at center, this musical took place in kind of the underworld Chicago in the 30s, and really, and Stockard Channing was in this, and it's kind of about a grifter who's trying to claw his way out of the underside of that L and try to reach above. But what we were doing is trying to like jam the perspective again, creating this space and this sort of abstracted place, this nightclub of sorts, and Stockard's entrance was basically literally a descent into the room, and then that center area is a mirrored fissure in the whole space that would erupt different bits of scenery. It could be the rehearsal room for the club, but then it could also be, there's showing some of the details, even all the lanterns were tilted and in this extreme perspective. The signs were all the neon was in perspective. So you go from a scene like this to a scene like that, where I'm almost like looking at like the glass of like Maison de Verre. This would slide down, and then this palette would come out with Stockard on it, and then she would sing Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered, and just this very simple kind of amount of context, and allow your imagination to fill in her level of status and class, and stark contrast into the bar in which we were spending our time. Sound. Dream sequence. He's imagining the club, and William Ivy Long did the costumes for this, so they were pretty incredible. This is a quick, I think I'm going to pick up my pace a little. Behanding in Spokane, this was a play that I did with Mark McDonough. I've done a few with him. He's done some incredible movies. In Bruges is one of his with Colin Farrell. And this was about, Chris Walken was in this, and I did the sets and the clothes with this as well. Chris plays a character who's had his hand cut off about 20 years before, and he's searching for his hand. His hand was placed on a train track, and it was severed, and they ran off with it. And he's been on the hunt for it for 20 years. So this is a play about atmosphere, and it's a very, very, very dark comedy. And I loved this reference of Gordon Matta Clark's, where he was like literally sawing through a room. And so I kind of riffed on that as a conceptual starting point and say, let's take that. And I like the idea of just slicing through the room in which this person is going to exist all evening. And then we made the model of a space, and the play had moments where, like Sam Rockwell was in this, Anthony Mackie, there was Zoe Kazan. It was like this kind of really creating atmosphere and mood. And there were moments where Sam Rockwell plays a clerk or the bellboy, and so this curtain would creak across almost those rails, and it was like having that train track present. The footlights were all old bathroom fixtures. It was really about getting kind of deep and into just the darkness of this exaggerated Gothic proportion of a motel room. Model. That curtain up on Chris. That's those moments that I'm talking about. Sam was brilliant. So props, I work very closely with the props department. In this case, that's basically a trunk that's just exploded with about 24 severed hands in it that he's been carrying around because none of them match his. He has a tattoo on his hand that he's trying to find, so he knows how to identify it, and ultimately you realize that it actually was in the bag the whole time. But there are a ton of people that are backstage making all this happen, and props specifically was incredible on this. And every once in a while this literally exploded open, and a hand would always kind of once in a while fall into the front row to have them kind of carefully placed back on the deck. This is one of the most brilliant monologues I've ever seen. Chris having a conversation with his mother on the phone where he still lived and at home, and she had found his porn, and it was mesmerizing. And just Chris is like a brilliant, brilliant man. And we had a very elaborate process of doing this play. This actually, when we were figuring it out, Daniel Craig and the Hugh play was actually happening, but Chris and I would have these phone conversations about how we were going to make him look real with the handoff. So he would call me, and he called me one day, and he was like, "Scott," and it was just kind of like when it would come up on the phone, you're kind of like, "Is this real?" And he just said, "I just saw this Spencer Tracy movie, like Bad Day at Black Rock." And he said, "You know it?" And I said, "I don't know it." So, well, he spends his whole evening with his hand in the pocket. And I said, "Yeah, that works on film, but I think we have to do a little better." He said, "Okay." And so we took that, and I had a prosthetic designer, and we spent probably about a month and a half developing the costume for him before the project would be signed off on. So there was a very heavily pressured day when the director flew from London to meet with me and Chris and walk around the stage where Steady Rain was being performed at night, because we were getting that theater right after that to do this theoretically. And so I'm really talking out of school, and I know this is being taped. He showed up, and there are seams that were being sewn in different direction. Things are padded. He walked in for a fitting one day and wore his these shoes, which I actually said, "Can I buy you new shoes and use your real shoes?" And those were his real shoes that we used. These awesome kind of loafers that were just really had been through it. And then gave him high waters. And Ben Brantley called this one of his favorite costumes he'd seen all season. And Chris, we got him all suited up. I'm sitting there sweating bullets through the whole thing. And he started walking around the stage and kind of feeling the prosthetic. And it was quite elaborate how it worked out. And then kind of looked up and was like, "Okay." Walked out the door, and then the project was on. As simple as that. And that was a lot of pressure, I will say. Now I've gone on. There he is. Amazing. I'm just going to quickly show you some documents that we do. This was for the first production, this exaggerated perspective of It's Only a Play with Nathan and Matthew and Megan Mullally. You can see how we're jamming the room. But this is one of many plates. There are probably about 30 plates for that show, where we're presenting these as an architect would, actually. Like, there's a set of bid documents that go to a shop. And I'm going to look at my notes here for this. It's like a typical build process for us is about 8 weeks, and I visit the shop throughout that's happening. They go to bid to the shops that are like really build Broadway scenery, and there are a number of them around New York, upstate, Connecticut, Long Island. And at that time, when the show is loading into the theater, that's basically when the cast starts rehearsal. So I've done a huge part of my job before the cast has even gotten in the room. So that's the idea of what Diane was talking about in her introduction, the idea of being flexible when there's ability to do that is really important, because there are discoveries that will be made while rehearsal is happening. And when architecture is being made, it is a very difficult marriage sometimes. So you try to almost anticipate some of those possibilities as much as one can. And then we usually preview for 3 to 4 weeks, and then there's opening night, and that's basically when my job is complete. And when there are long-running shows like Mormon, Something Rotten that's going now, and Neverland, I'll check in every few weeks to make sure that everything stays at the same level, and you know, the finishes are fine, the paint on the deck looks good, no props are looking battered. And there are people there that are hired to do that every day, but every once in a while when they know I'm in the room, it gets a little heated, and they make sure that they're really on point, which is great. I'm just going to kind of go through a couple more of these. I've done a few shows. This is kind of my hobby in a way. The New York Botanical Garden has invited me to design 3 exhibitions there. The first one where I met them really was they wanted to do their orchid show, which is a big annual event for them, and they wanted the theme to be on Broadway, and they wanted to feature a specific designer doing the whole thing. So they chose me, which was really generous, and it was really fun. I mean, it's, again, like not my austere style, but it was fun to just kind of go crazy in there. And this was the sort of featured piece when you walked in, and all of those swags were made out of garden hose. And then right now I'm doing, I've done the Frida Kahlo show, so that was great to kind of have a complete contrast to something as elaborate as that. This is quite austere by contrast. This is Coast of Utopia, an image that from that project where it was just an epic trilogy of Russian plays at Lincoln Center that went from the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution. It was all played in a huge, almost football field size room of black reflective Lexan that we had to, we would take blowtorches to it to keep it polished. I mean, it was a crazy level of design and a massive team of people working on this. There were 3 plays altogether, and this just showed the one scene, the Champs-Élysées, and the extreme perspective of those sculptures. I think are about 16 feet. The floor was reinforced with steel because they actually, during the Revolution, like literally were blown apart, and the horse on stage right would fall down and hit the floor. And there's Ethan Hawke, who was in this. The upstage lamp was probably about as tall as my knee, and the downstage was probably about 18 feet tall, and it just looked like you were like miles away. This is a project I did with Diane, and this is really, I was the first American set designer to work with Cirque du Soleil on designing a set for them, and that was quite something. And the process for that project, from blank slate, literally not even the acrobats or acts figured out, to opening was about 3 years. And I moved to Montreal for January, February, March, April, May, like what they call the unlivable months to do this project. From January until May, when the sun starts to come out, was when we opened. But this is what Diane talked about a little bit, about the immersion of designing in a tent, where, you know, a tent by its nature really wants to be an umbrella, and you don't want to be suspending things from it. It's the posts that want to be the support. And this is touring. It's been touring the world for 3 years. I think it's in Europe now. But this was the first project that Cirque did where the cast was a much greater percentage female than male, and I felt the set should be reflective of that and be much more lyrical and not about big heavy objects. And there were miles and miles of this tube, and people would run down the ramps and just glide their hand over it, and the whole thing would kind of move as if in a storm. And this was that sort of magical island that Diane spoke of. It was a great experience, and just the engineers designing acrobatic equipment with the most brilliant people on the planet doing that was pretty incredible. They'd never done a water bowl holding like thousands of pounds of water on a traveling show before, and they pulled it off. And again, you can see when it's almost an installation how important the lighting is to shift character and tone and atmosphere and even focus. Yeah, South Park. Matt and Trey and Bobby Lopez, amazing. This was Book of Mormon. That's been now running 4 years, and when I was brought in to do that, that was great. And Matt and Trey are hilarious. When I came in, the first thing I did was take the project, and I had been in a number of plays in my church when I was a kid, and so I took that experience of these liturgical passion plays that they really influenced the opening of the show for me, and also the idea of seeing this architectural frame which draws on some references in Mormon temple architecture, most specifically La Jolla, Hala. But it's given this storytelling power. It's almost to me like a pair of jazz hands, where it's illuminated, it's showbiz, it's the sacred and the profane at the same time. And you can see when you walk in, you see this, what I call the Jesus sunrise, and then you start to see, oh my God, there's Star Wars, there's 8 planets, and it's all it takes a minute to take it all in, but it sets up the tone of the show, and that frame actually becomes a character in the play. And for me, and even on every iteration of the tour, it's something that we are slavish about reproducing beautifully, because it's our viewfinder, so to speak. And I always feel like the play and the musical here, it's about what gets you through the day. As long as you're not harming anyone, whatever you believe, as long as it gets you through the day, it doesn't matter what it is. And an early sketch for Salt Lake City, and this just played in Salt Lake City a few weeks ago, actually, and to huge response, which was fantastic. And so when they saw their city duplicated in this form, I heard it was pretty amazing. And the guys, and you can see everything's very blue and crisp and clean here. The minute and Josh Gad and Andrew Reynolds were in the original cast. And then when we go to Uganda, there's a convention in Broadway theater, and the guys, Matt and Trey, are really obsessed with American theater, and they're like a series of portals, left and right legs and wings overhead. And what you're able to do is you get lighting from those sides, but you're also able to erupt cast and dancers and scenery. So you're constantly crossing left and right, and you're able to get a lot of different looks by flying things in and out and shifting the looks of that. So what we did when I got to Uganda, the moment we open up, there's a portal that closes down, so it's all navy, and the 2 guys are singing the song. It opens up, and you see this Uganda, and there's almost this wah wah sound, and one of the Ugandans dragging a sort of cow carcass across the stage. But what I've done with those portals here, so that we can do that same, erupt dancers onto the space, but I literally burned them, they were torched and torn. So we're taking the convention of American musical theater and just literally burning it. Yeah, Josh and Andrew. Hell. And this is their version of the story when they're actually taking presenting their own pageant of what they've learned, which is by Josh Gad's character, very askew from what the actual Book of Mormon is supposed to be. And their corn husk doll of Moroni, the angel at the top there. This is a model for a revival that I was doing at the same time. I was running through, once we opened Book of Mormon, this was right theater next door called the Walter Kerr, and it was a revival of The House of Blue Leaves with Ben Stiller and Edie Falco. And this takes place in '65 on the eve of the papal visit, and it's a very, very black comedy. And we wanted to do it in architecture. It's normally more, tenement style, and this was more of a modern building in Sunnyside, Queens, so you could kind of get a sense of a modern building that had just been kind of fallen to ruin, and also just even internally. Walls don't meet purposefully, carpets hanging over, and that paper sky was something that we were obsessed with. And then in fabrication, it became a pretty ambitious task to kind of figure out how to do that. But it was a lot of starch and a lot of gauze, and Ben and Edie were amazing. But the whole thing split apart at the very end, like it did in that model, when he kills his schizophrenic wife, which is Edie's character. But this also just shows the level. You could almost shoot the movie on this set, the level of detail with the set decorators and myself and prop masters all working to literally have every bit of paper in front of Ben and them, just to be so specific. There are nuns that are running around on the ceilings, scurrying down the fire escape and coming in the window. It was a pretty gymnastic set. And also every view in the audience was different because it was such an extreme angle and the shards of which you saw. So we were kind of balancing what people would see at different times. This was Pippin, which I did with Diane. The first revival of the musical, which is considered a troubled musical or a tricky one. And she won the Tony as well as the production. It was really a radical reinvention of this musical, which takes place during the medieval reign of Charlemagne. And we made it into this gymnastic circus-based spectacle that had its roots in, for me, the traveling medicine shows and other spectacles that when everyone leaves town, there's a sort of lack of, loss of wonder in a way. And as though the circus picks up and leaves to go on to the next town, leaving the people in the town kind of wondering, what was that, and should I follow it? And in this case, Pippin, the character, ultimately leaves the circus to find love and family, and so it left without him. And what it does in the end, the tent itself, with automation, actually all rolls up and goes up into the sky, and everything is pulled apart, and we see all the props that we've seen all night long from the show that they've been telling us into this more meta space of exposing the back wall of the theater and literally laying everything bare for the story that we've told all evening. Sketch for a project I did with Bette Midler called I'll Eat You Last. It's about a Hollywood agent who was representing Barbra Streisand, and she, Bette sat on the sofa. It was scripted for her only to not move for 90 minutes. So in this case, the costume designer Ann Roth, who amazing, great friend, and won the Oscar for English Patient, frequent collaborator, and she and I were working on Mormon in London, and I kind of said, she's got to be in peacock. I've got the sofa's got to be peach, and we were having this whole she's like, I found this pink fabric. I said, it won't work. We got to do peach. But she said she's got the cost. We have to work on this, to make sure that that it was slave. To me, I wanted to represent the world of Sue, because her estate had actually gone to auction a few months before, and so I'd seen a few of the pieces that had been in her house, and I knew other actors that had actually been there. She was famous for these dinner parties, and so I wanted to root it in the reality of her last home, and. But then again, pull it apart a little bit, and I'll show you. The walls, there are walls kind of missing, and it's a little bit abstracted. So the reality is there, but it sort of bleeds away at the edges. The palm trees kind of just shoot up abstractly off left, stage left, which is that side. Is a sort of indication of gravel kind of leading to a pool. And you'll see this is a space. So because she was being rooted for 90 minutes in this space, said, well, then I have to do some action, and I've got to be able to transform, because it's a long time to be seated, and Bette is brilliant. But the place actually has to be a character, and really starts with Sue, who's at the top of her game, and we watch this kind of decline. And her top client, we're basically waiting for a phone call when Barbara leaves her. And she knows the call's coming. So it's, for me, a kind of, the end of her career. So I devised a hallway upstage, which was created just for the last moment of the play. It's the very moment she stands up finally, balances herself, and then kind of walks out smoking a cigarette. And it became her kind of walk into the light at the very end. And when the lights go down, we saw her kind of more and more reflected in the glass, because there were these massive panes of glass left behind her, and her head would be exposed. And it just kind of made her into this vulnerable person, and this humanity kind of began to appear. The last time I saw this was in LA, and the director and I were sitting in the back row, and Barbara came with James Brolin. And we knew she was going to be in, but Bette didn't know. Again, another secret I'm giving away. So there was a protocol in place to get Barbara in the building that they had done before, and Joe, the director, and I sat in the very back row, and they were sitting in the very back row, a little bit left of us. And it was kind of amazing. I have to say, I was mesmerized by her incredible ability to hold a resting face while hurtled obscenities are being thrown at her by her onstage agent. And there was an article that came out afterwards about how accurate the depiction was, and she was very cool about it, but from what I'm told, it was pretty accurate. Anyway, lighting was a huge thing. We went from evening to night, and it was a project I'm really proud of, and we had a really good time, and Bet was brilliant. This last two, Airline Highway just did this at Steppenwolf, came to Broadway. This is doing hyper realism and really figuring out how to do this absolute reality, which to me it's abstracted just by the simple fact that it's taking place behind a frame in a theater. And this takes place in New Orleans on the fringe, literally and figuratively, with the characters that are kind of serving the people and the tourists living in this really post-Katrina beaten down motel. Each room I had kind of art directed for each character. The office, you could walk into all of them and almost shoot the film. It was really for each character to be able to emerge from and be very specific. And again, seeing the change of light on this, going from mourning to this party that they were throwing, this living funeral for the matriarch of the bunch. And my favorite prop was a beer cup that we placed in the windowsill that they had to put in every night that I kind of fell in love with, which is right there. You can barely see it. And then there were these ethereal moments that would just completely transform the space. Last one, The Visit. Kander and Ebb's last musical, who wrote Chicago, and I did this with Chita Rivera, an incredible team. And this is about a widow who's returning with revenge to a small European town. And this was had many locations in the musical. We condensed it to one sort of poetic crucible that was the idea of a train station that had been kind of almost swallowed by nature. What has happened here, just for a brief context, is a derelict. It represents this Middle European town called Brocken, and it's been destroyed secretly by Cheetah's character, she's bought each industry as she's had these very successful marriages, shut them all down, and she returns years later to pay them billions to save them all, but only for the corpse of her long-lost love, who had wronged her many years before. She was impregnated by him, and he chose the merchant's daughter as his love. And so she was scorned and sent out, and so she comes back to exact revenge. And needless to say, they kill him, but rationalize it by saying it's for the greater good. And so I'll wrap this up. My mom loves this one. This is one of her favorite sets of mine. And thanks for listening. A little long.
Wow. Well, your drawings are beautiful.
Oh,
are you selling those? What do you do with those drawings?
I archive them, but I have sold them. Sometimes I give them to people.
They're
thanks.
Maybe we could get one from you.
Sure.
For our library. So what we are trying to do here is, maybe I can start with one question or a few questions, and then we can open up to the audience. I think I got very stuck with this idea of emotional content, maybe because I love this book from Dimitris Pikionis, a Greek architect that has this amazing book called Sentimental Topography, and where he talks a lot about time and accumulation of pieces that are ruins of ruins. Mm-hmm. So there's this sense of time and control of time in your work, but there's also this, and you talk about drama all the time, this emotional space. So I'm interested in the process of building, of crafting this emotional space. And how do you start to think about that?
It's different for musicals as it is from plays. I mean, most often I start to figure out how many places am I going and how many places do I need to show. I'm going to say, like, the last one, like with Cheetah, I mean, it's about ruin, and also the person that ruined it is with us. So it was originally impressive, and then I mean, I don't know, I just kind of try to give a life to these spaces that add something to not only the subtext that's there, but also make it a character. But while, like, that scene had forest locations, and so the light would shift, and then all those vines would become very present. So you're kind of shifting back and forth, but like, as I talk about collaboration a lot because it's so essential. Like, I'm working with a lighting designer constantly, and saying like, let's pull back here, let's push that a little bit farther. But the idea of like layers, even in that Chris Walken play, in the corner there's a closet that I just put in there, and you can see the moldings on the wall on the inside of the closet, and I did it as though this insertion in that room had been done, 40 years before, but they'd taken out the armoire to upgrade the hotel and make it a little modern. So it's like impressing these layers of time over something that may be noticeable to 5 people, but they may not know it, but they're feeling it. And I think there's this level of authenticity that's trying to be, that we're all trying to strive for, and also a level of interest. Make it specific. I think specificity becomes really important, because I think things can be general. Like I'm not a big fan of seeing a set where I'm like, well, I could tell that story or that story. I want them to be absolutely specific to the story that I'm telling, and not let it be interchangeable to a number of others. So I think finding that specificity, so that's the only play that could be told on that set, is really important.
And it seems like what you're talking about, this atmosphere, and I have a particular interest on that. There's this condition, and there's these moments that are very striking, that it seems like the scene smells. So this idea of specificity, and I want to go back to that. So when you imagine a scene, when we imagine a condition of this scene, this character, the looming atmosphere, the looming drama that is there, are you very specific on determining, that's that wall has a weathered part there, has water here, has a reflection there, there's light that comes in and reflects and highlights this thick air that is built.
I think you're talking about tone, I think, to me, and I think it's important that like each play or musical has a tone, and I think supporting that with all your choices is really important. And I think that is a very different tone for a Nathan Lane comedy, and like It's Only a Play with Nathan and Matthew, as opposed to The Visit or something darker like Behanding or even Peter Grimes, where there's a much more ominous tone and Gothic proportions are kind of being employed to kind of have them be a little bit more like uncomfortable in the space and like exaggerate things a little bit more. So I start to think about the tone, because comedy certainly needs a certain temperature, and I even choose paint colors because I know people are going to look good in front of that, or when I want them to look good in front of that, and they're going to look pale, or they're going to look like they'll blend in with the environment. Kind of everything has a choice. I mean, I've just worked with this amazing costume designer, Greg Barnes, on Something Rotten. Every costume that came out, I just looked at him and I said, oh my God, there are like 100 decisions on every costume. The number of like bits of this or that, and they're all supporting a character choice for him, and like the same way that my work is supporting character choices for the play.
I want to go back to this idea of hyper-realism and this exacerbation. Everything you've been showing here, they are thick, and there's a certain drama and spectacle associated with them. You didn't show images of this piece and these images that I like very much from the Vertical Hours with Julianne Moore, our beautiful Julianne Moore. I don't know. But it's a different. It seems like there's an idea of restraint that is very different with that project. That is different from here.
She played as sort of a professor at Yale, and I did that show with Sam Mendes, and we went to Yale and looked at some offices and things. And but basically, for me, that was about compression and expansion. It took place in her office, and then it took place in the British countryside of her partner's father's home, and it was basically on the side of a hill, like a dinner party was happening, and it was under a tree. So I was working in London, and we sculpted this massive tree, and it was beautiful, almost Chekhovian in a way. Like there were like the floorboards, so it was not realistic at all. Like there were these floorboards, there was this huge circular cyc, and then this tree, which was incredibly real looking, and the kind of shock of seeing that tree, which it's very, very difficult to do nature on stage. Like it's one of the toughest tasks. And this was sculptors from London and sculptors from New York all coming together to kind of make this thing happen. But what we started with when the curtain went up, there was literally this very tiny office. And in a transition, in a very quick one, she escapes and goes downstairs, and all in a very quick flash of black. And that whole room lifted out, and the tree had been kind of literally designed to cradle that room so that the room could escape and then still cover the whole stage space. And that was, I don't know, that's sort of, I love that play. It was very difficult, I will say that. I sat there kind of sweating
But
out
how
that
difficult
tree.
is to do restrained things that are super edited.
Yeah, they hyper-edited, actually.
Right,
yeah,
right,
hyper-edited.
right.
Every floorboard was chosen because of its beauty,
Right,
yeah.
right. I recommend you guys to see that. Well, I can continue over and over, and then I can. But I think it's a good time to open up to the audience and check if there are any particular questions. As I will continue.
Come on, be bold, be bold.
You might introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm an architecture student here.
Cool.
I love how so many of your sets, you cut the edge of the building, so it looks like a kind of a section cut. And I'm curious if you could speak to that kind of in your choices spatially and kind of thinking about architecture. You use the word austerity a lot. I'm curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I always feel like the audience is the fourth wall of those spaces. So when I cut it away, I imagine that we're removing that architecture so that we're taking a slice of that life away. I mean, it's really kind of a figurative thing for me where, like, it's very literal in Behanding where it is severed. But you have to remember that I'm designing for a very, very sharp series of sight lines, extreme left, extreme right, and up here, and then lower orchestra. So there's a range of views that I'm constantly designing for. It's not really an object like architecture that I can perceive from a bunch of different points of view. I'm really dealing with a very controlled perception. But yeah, I like exposing the materials, and that might speak to the architect in me and choosing to know how things go together and then see that slice does become important. And I like to, I guess, manipulate it. Brooklyn, go. No, whoever, yeah. No, I saw someone with the Brooklyn t-shirt that was saying something.
Basic question, but I just wondered if you could give an example of a time that you were under either like budgetary constraints or otherwise maybe a conflict with costume or something that you had an idea, like you wanted to use Lexan, Tyvek, whatever it was, and then you were forced to rework it. And I don't know if that's your purview or at some point it's the set builders who have to deal with the alternatives, but just
they can help. They can certainly help. One quick example that comes to my mind: in November, that Nathan Lane play, the whole roof at the very end was supposed to hinge open, almost like a hat box, and flood the whole place with these balloons. And it just became budgetarily impossible. It was engineeringly possible, and we had figured it out. So ultimately, the presidential seal that was in the middle kind of sucked up and slid over like a van door and then kind of came through there. I always felt like, it feels like a toilet. But anyway, instead of being this like big idea, it was a little marginalized, but it still worked and it was festive. But it would have been much more like, had it been done that way. So that's one example. No, we're constantly dealing with budgets, constantly. It's very rare that I'm like given a blank check. It's like the world, it's real.
Maybe the Brooklyn t-shirt? Sorry, what's your name?
Come on, Brooklyn.
Hi, my name is Hyo, and I'm actually not from Brooklyn. But, it's actually a similar question. I was wondering if you had any conflicts with the director, and specifically
because you guys want the dirt.
Well, specifically because directors are usually, we sort of imagine that directors have control over the whole piece. And
I think that's sort of what I said before. I think that's a big misconception. I mean, a lot of the projects that I've been working on or that I've shown you today, some of them are like a half dozen of them might be with one director. I mean, we become like family. And then I'm going back to do a musical next week with the director I've worked with. This is my first time. So we're kind of like finding our way with each other. And directors aren't tyrants. They want to bring the best out of me in order to bring the best to them. And I'm at my best when we're kind of a team. I mean, that's the only way I can say it. Because I think the work in which, and the field in which I'm a part is so hugely collaborative. and sometimes things don't work. I mean, there's no lie. Sometimes someone that's a part of the team is not working, and it changes, and it's much more, Broadway is a business, and when we work in regional theater or in what I'll call non-commercial theater, it's maybe a different situation. Broadway is a big business, and I'm so grateful to be a part of it. I never could imagine that I could make a living doing what I do and go to the places that I've gone, but there is sometimes an aspect where it is very apparent that this aspect of the team or whatever is not working, and changes have to be made, whether it's in cast, crew, team, whatever. It just happens. It's like life.
Hi. First, thank you. That was really inspiring.
So I feel like I'm slightly, I just have to confess, I'm slightly tired. I was in China last week, and I feel like when I get tired, I drone on, and I get the Arizona vibe, and my voice drops and becomes so hypnotically sleepy. But anyway, so thanks for staying in it. Now go on.
What is the Arizona vibe?
He didn't grow up there.
Do you mind to introduce yourself?
I'm Taylor. In the beginning, in your introduction, you mentioned that you were really inspired about how we feel in spaces and how spaces can make you feel human. And I was curious to know if you ever considered doing any work that was more permanent, or if you prefer to have your home be the permanent space. And
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I have a house in Tucson that I have done, and it's been kind of a spatial experiment where I get to play with materials and light, actually, because that's a place where I love the light there. And so I am doing that. I'm renovating an apartment now in New York that I've been working on for a few months. But I keep that pretty private. Someone in Chicago just asked me to do a story interior that they want to make installation and evolve over time. And so I'm kind of intrigued with that. I've been asked to do a couple of restaurants, but it doesn't speak to me, I don't think. I mean, I love what I do. That may change. I mean, some days I feel like I'm going to go and do ceramics in the desert or something, but I think that this story idea seems intriguing, but because he wants to do it in a presentational way with a narrative base, then it's interesting to me. So.
thank you. I mean, with new forms of media, that's very.
What's that?
With media, with new forms of like Instagram and how it's.
Yeah, I mean, I just started
itself.
doing Instagram, so yeah, follow me. Put me over 2,000 today, people. Scott Pask Studio. I'm at 19 something today, weirdly. Yeah, no, my brother, I have a twin brother who's a fashion director, and he lives in New York as well, and he has a huge following in the Far East, and because he was a director at GQ and New York Times. Instagram's important. I mean, it's something where people can see your work in a place where you've never been, and they reach out to you, and I've met people and friends, and I don't know, it's a global visual thing to me, and so it's becoming more interesting to me. I don't know.
Hi, I'm Patrick. I was just curious if you could talk about the theaters themselves and not so much the stage. In terms of when you get a new project or a new play, how much time do you actually spend just sitting, understanding the direction from which people look at it, or the kind of seating arrangement, as every theater is a lot different?
The Broadway theaters, there's a range, but I mean, some of them, I know a lot of them now really well. But it is a huge factor, and I think I deal with a frame, and are we going to respect the frame, or are we going to violate it? And the first musical that I did, the first Broadway musical I did was Urinetown, and it was in the Henry Miller Theater, and the theater was being condemned, and the only thing that was remaining was the facade. So we went outside, and we literally took the street as our starting point, and I took plywood, and we plywooded over the whole thing as though we were walking into this condemned building, and painted the whole interior of the theater black. And then had teams of scenic artists coming in and aging it as the whole thing had been kind of inundated with water and then dried out, which is the story of Urinetown. It's they have no water. And the set reached out in the audience and was industrial and kind of impressing a life on this, what was the theater, what is it now? Again, giving another layer where it became almost, for me, a layer of incarceration. It was about industrial architecture being kind of impressed on the theater. So there are examples when it's incredibly intimately tied to the theater, and then there are others where we're looking at the frame and just going, oh my God, I wish we had one more foot of wing space because we just need to get that thing on. And then they become very constraining. Those theaters on Broadway are largely vaudevillian, and they're very shallow, and so the minute we know what the theater is, a matter of feet can become very important in what we're doing and how we're conceiving things. I'm doing a play next year that's an adaptation, or in the spring, that I did originally a few years ago, and it was intended to go to Broadway, and then we've kind of taken this long break, and it's a lot smaller, so it becomes this very intricate adaptation. But I think that's where the architecture for me becomes exciting. I like doing the various iterations of projects. I've had shows that have gone, like Hair went from an exterior to an interior, and the public was flipped out. They're like, what are you going to do? The stars and the grass were such a huge thing. I completed the Delacorte Theater by just adding a wall in the back and kind of harnessing the energy when there was like 20 feet more of space. And I covered it with trees back there that people thought existed. And people would come and go, oh my God, the theater looks amazing. And we had grass laid by like 20 people. And it just looked like all we'd done was set up a bandstand. And then we moved it downtown. They were like, how do you do this? I said, well, let's just take the theater as our crucible for this show. And there had to have been an art director in that hippie bunch. So we came in and just blew a mural all over a wall that we built, but that wall was false, and it was downstage by 3 feet of the actual theater to create more energy and push the energy closer to the audience. We raked the stage, but so that energy's pouring down. And all the choices that I made, when Oscar Eustis said to me, he said, you know what, this is all on your back. Like, this was a hit. Now how are you going to make it inside? I said, the one thing I have on my side is the cast's energy, which wasn't harnessed in that room. So I can do that, and that's what's going to be the sort of golden ticket here, and it was. So adaptation is something I'm always thinking about. That's the fun of it, I think.
Something that you never show is the infrastructure of effect. And that leads me to this idea of technology, and particularly nowadays there's this kind of interest on technology and virtual images, and it's also part of the creation of illusion. Do you see yourself embracing with new technologies? And that BAM recently was this theater that was kind of creating a hologram that was part of one of the characters. What is your position relative to that?
Yeah, I mean, we're embracing it as much as we can. I mean, there's so much automation in some of these shows that they're up to the minute as far as theater automation. We're dealing in the studio with computer programs that are able to show directors how things are moving. So much of it is about not having surprises in the theater because we have such a truncated amount of time, and when the shows become big and elaborate, you want to make sure that it's all about planning, that we know what it's going to be. I mean, technology, I remember getting a phone call once when there was a huge musical coming from London, and the owner of the Schubert organization called me and said, Scott, what are you going to feel like? You're going to be out of a job soon. And because it was hugely projection-based, like everything was projection. And it was a ghost story, and so I said, I think Jerry Schoenfeld, rest in peace, I said, that is something that probably serves the woman in white very well. But I said, I can't imagine there's not ever going to be a need for someone to pick up a glass and actually interact with something, and not it just be some sort of elusive image that's behind them, giving them scale or scalelessness. So I think there's always going to have to be human interaction. But technology is present when I think it supports a narrative. Technology can also overwhelm something. There's things that I'm doing where I don't want the technology to be noticed because it will interfere with the tone of the piece in which I'm working. So it always has to be reflecting the tone.
This weight, it's very present in your work. It's great. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jen. I was really admiring the frames, especially in the thumbnails and illustrations, and how you're able to so clearly convey, an idea, a thought, a message. And I was curious how much maybe cartooning or illustration has sort of influenced that process of communicating your work, and if there are any cartoonists or illustrators that have been influential.
Kind of always drawn that way. I don't know. Like, I always draw little, and I always kind of draw, like, if the paper's here, I always draw a little square, and always to the left side of the page, and then I write my notes on the right. I don't know. Yeah, is it? Really? Oh, God. So it's an educator that we share. So it was beaten into my head in school. When I just did Something Rotten, I hired an illustrator who I've worked with a lot, just because I wanted to translate everything as though it had gone through an ink pen of sort of Shakespearean writer. So I would take my drawings and then they'd put them through his filter. So I have worked with people in my studio that will do that specifically. But for my personal sketches, I just doodle like that. And most of them I don't really show. I mean, I'll show some to the directors, but I don't really. I mean, the one thing, we are very process-based. I'm very process-based.
It's a kind of a storyboard, like
yeah, exactly.
Almost the same techniques as filmmakers.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's
filmmaker.
literally looking frame to frame. So you're completely right. They're my personal comic books. And when we sit actually in the theater, and sometimes we'll take the model photos of, like for a musical, if there are 8 transitions in Act 1 and 10 into Act 2, I have that in a binder. Daniel here sitting here did it for Waitress for me, and you are flipping back and forth going, okay, where do I have to get, just to make sure that I'm keeping the story consistent and in my mind. And it can start with those little sketches for me, which is how it always starts, and then it finishes where we're sitting in the rehearsal room or on the stage with the very elaborate ones.
So it's 8 o'clock. Maybe we
I've
should.
exhausted you all. Let's go.
Maybe it's a good time to stop and thank you again.
Thank you for
your
coming.
wonderful-
Appreciate it on a hot day like this.